Privatization seems to be the new mantra of the Modi government. In the last 2 weeks, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has made a strong pitch for the private sector and said that the government can't do everything. IAS officers cannot run everything from fertilizer factories to airlines. This was followed by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman making a similar pitch and saying that the BJP government or the BJP and its predecessor, the Jana Sangh, was always in favor of Indian industries, which she meant was the private sector. So it is very obvious that the Modi government is trying to put the onus of growth on the private sector to revive the economy and also get the government out of a lot of sectors which the government, we all say, has no business being in. So the government has no business being in the business of business. But is this mantra something that works just on its own now that the government has decided, okay, fine, tomorrow the private sector will start producing and multiplying its earnings and growth will automatically come back and we'll all be happy with double-digit growth? Is it something that happens that automatically? Or is there something which the government needs to consciously do to help the private sector achieve what it wants to achieve? Hi, and welcome to a new episode of Economics. We have Professor Ila Patnaik with us, who will take this topic and also take your questions. I'm Rajesh, Managing Editor at ThePrint, and we look forward to answering all your queries in the next half an hour or so. So please send your questions. Hi, Ila, welcome. This this thrust on the private sector. First of all, coming as it did so strongly from the government in the budget, in the subsequent speech of the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, is that something that has surprised you?
Well, I think the surprise was in 2014 when it did not happen. The NDA won, as well as the BJP's philosophy that the private sector could grow the way the NDA one had pushed outbound foreign investment by India, by Indian companies, as well as reduced tariffs, making it very competitive. I think a lot of people had expected right in 2014, when Mr. Modi became the Prime Minister, that he would bring in these reforms. So, slogans like minimum government, maximum governance, the government has no business being in business, and such had actually made people very optimistic about seeing reforms such as privatization, entry of the private sector. But, it didn't happen then. And perhaps, the government was new or there were other things on its mind. But I think now when the economy is in a crisis of, low growth, low investment, when fiscal trouble is very clear, so the government can invest but has limited capabilities, when unemployment is high, then it's a welcome surprise to see the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister go back to saying that the private sector is the one that will bring growth. At the time of the budget also, the budget was really the first statement where it came out clearly when it was emphasized that the privatization would be done, assets would be monetized, and so on. Banks would be privatized, public sector banks would be privatized. So I think it is a change in policy since Modi became PM. And after that, now that we are seeing it, let's see how it goes forward.
But also, you have written in your column, which was published on the print.in today, for the benefit of our viewers, we will be giving the link of that column in the description of the video. You have argued about 5, specific key factors that need to be kept in mind, and the government needs to focus on to be able to make sure that this thrust on the private sector works. Would you like to briefly touch upon those 5 points, Ila?
Oops. Yeah, so basically, one is trying to, basically, the issue is that is the private sector just saying that there should be a private sector, is that enough? Or is it that we need to create conditions for the private sector to function well? And I'm arguing that the government needs to create conditions for the private sector to function. And without those conditions, the private sector will not be able to function. One of those is a low and stable, is the policy environment. So the policy environment should not keep changing. It should remain stable. And you start with the tax regime, for example, that we have experience of what happened when there was retrospective taxation, that India became an unattractive proposition for foreign investors, for domestic investors, when there is tax uncertainty. People, after all, invest because they want post-tax returns. So their focus is on post-tax returns. And if the tax rate changes, or if the tax regime changes such that you need to pay taxes where you didn't have to, then their returns change, and that creates an environment of uncertainty. So I think part of one of the most important things for investment is less uncertainty, more policy stability, whether it's environmental policy, whether it's tax policy, whether it's capital controls. The environment isn't just about the government saying we want privatization, but doing all of these things. Now we can go into each one by one, because I think that is what we are arguing in our uh, article. Radhika Pandey and I, my colleague Radhika and I, are arguing in our column today, is that there are factors such as, we argue for a stable tax regime, contract enforcement, which is something that the private sector needs. So you enter into a contract with somebody, you expect that that should happen. Now, the kind of judicial delays, the difficulties in courts, the difficulties in enforcing contracts is something that India has not been able to improve. So when you look at our ease of doing business, we've done better on many of the other factors, but we haven't been able to do well on contract enforcement. Similarly, a well-functioning financial market. So when you think of the role of finance, the role of finance is really to be the brain of the economy, which means that it is the brain that allocates resources. So if a bank is lending to the most productive project, then, and each bank does that, then it is our household savings go to the most productive projects. So, that allocates resources to more efficient and more productive projects. Whereas if the banking system lends because of political reasons, because of other pressures, corruption, then obviously it is not going to result in a good allocation of resources for the economy. Do you want to, have any, if you have any questions, then maybe we can do that. Otherwise, I can go on for the
No,
remaining.
I will. I just want to quickly talk. I mean, the third, fourth, and fifth points you have mentioned in a well-functioning financial sector, which you talked about. Fourth was improved foreign investment climate, and fifth is developing infrastructure. Developing infrastructure is something the government has been talking about, and if our viewers notice, even already in the last several weeks, the government has announced a lot of projects, inaugurated projects, and plans for more roads and railways and ports are being talked about. It's like a huge bonanza for the infrastructure sector, at least in terms of plans and announcements. Of course, we have to wait and see the implementation and execution of these projects. But there is one point you made, Ila, on improved foreign investment climate, and this is something I think even we talked about before you wrote this piece. Is this whole focus on the private sector on the one hand, and then saying we will be Atmanirbhar, self-reliant, uh, we should do it on our own. Maybe we don't need foreign investors as much as some people might argue. Where are you on that one? Because you're talking about an improved foreign investment climate in your piece also.
Yeah, so if you look at the Atmanirbhar package, I think part of what has been done is to try to increase domestic production. Now, in some cases, it is by offering protection to domestic industry. But at the same time, I mean, some of the PLI schemes, for example, are meant the recent, production-linked incentives for the telecom sector and for mobile phones. Now, a lot of these are meant for attracting foreign producers to come to India, foreign companies to come and produce here. So let's, make that distinction. One is that do we want to keep importing? And the other is we want to let foreign capital come in, bring in technology, bring in management, and produce here and create employment here. My understanding of the Atmanirbhar package is that we want the latter. So we don't want to import everything. So in that sense, we are saying we want to be self-reliant, but we don't say that we'll not get technology or capital from abroad. So even we saw a signal of that in terms of in the last few years, we've seen some improvement in the climate for or the process through which foreign companies have to go through or trying to open single window or now giving PLI, or we've seen even in insurance. So it's not just in goods, but even in services, we've seen the FDI cap go up. So my understanding of Atmanirbhar Bharat is not that we don't want to open up to the world at all. We want to open up to the world, but we want companies to come here and produce here. We don't want to lose employment and manufacturing to countries such as China.
Mhm.
So that seems to
Um,
be the package.
we have a lot of questions from our viewers, and I must also tell our viewers that I see some people making comments that YP Rajesh is always looking down at his phone. It's bad manners. Actually, I need to apologize. I don't look at the phone because I'm not paying attention to the conversation, because I get the questions people send on my phone from our production team, which is the reason I have to keep focusing on the questions and which questions to take and which ones not to take. So please don't misunderstand that as not paying attention to what Ela is saying. I cannot afford to do that. We have a lot of questions, Ela, and before we take those questions, I have to make my appeal to our viewers. We take your questions, we try to give the best answers, at least the answers we think are the right answers. We don't take sides, we are unhyphenated. We don't have a side, whether it is left or right. We stick to the facts. We analyze what Ela has to say in terms of the economic issue of the day. And this unhyphenated journalism is not easy or cheap. It will sustain and improve and get better, and we'll be able to do more of this when you contribute and take subscriptions. So please subscribe to The Print. We are a young digital organization and we need your support to sustain and grow. So let me go to our questions today, Ela. The first one is from Deepak. This has come on Twitter. Thank you, Deepak. Uh, is a 5 trillion economy a realistic target without resolving issues like contract reinforcement, labor laws, and land reforms?
So I think the environment for the private sector investment has not been very good. And I mean, actually, I go back all the way to 1991, where we liberalized industry, but we did not liberalize either finance or agriculture. So it was, trying to run on one leg, where we've been talking about how public sector banks are inefficient, loss making, are required to function better to be able to allocate resources properly. Similarly, I mean, I've raised contract enforcement myself, but a lot of the reforms that needed to accompany privatize privatization or liberalization that happened, those reforms did not happen. I'm not blaming one government or another. I'm simply saying that all these years, whatever the reasons are, various things, various forces act on various parts of the economy and policymakers. But net, we have not been able to reform either our financial sector or agriculture or judiciary in the manner in which we would have liked to do for it to support private sector growth all these decades. So absolutely, that's what's needed. And whether you give a number 5 trillion, 10 trillion, whatever number you choose, the point really is that you need to change the environment such that the private sector uh, wants to invest.
The next question is from Kamal. This one has also come on Twitter, Leela. And it's a classic economic question. Is there any proof that wealth collectors are also wealth distributors in good proportion?
I don't understand the question. YP, explain.
I think he's saying he's talking about the trickle down theory, that people who create wealth, as in the industrialists, the corporates, the people who become rich themselves when an economy does well, are they good at distributing that also?
Well, if I look at what the world does, then clearly that's not the case, that they're not good enough. Because I think all over the world, including in India, we see governments do welfare programs, do transfer payments. So if all that was required was trickle down, that we had some people getting rich and then they spending, employing people, and then that going down, maybe it will happen, but the time taken will be so long that we as a society cannot afford that.
Mhm,
So what governments do all over is tax and
mhm.
redistribute. So they want to get there faster. I mean, it's also seems unfair that when our value system does not allow it, that there are people who are dying of hunger and may continue to do so for many decades more while we wait for the trickle down to happen. So governments typically do intervene, do redistribution, do welfare programs, and that happens all over the world.
But also, my own thought on this, Ila, is that especially new economy companies, whether it is in the West or whether it's even in India, the IT companies, the digital companies, they have, been more liberal in giving ESOPs to their employees and even to people who are not, say, white collar workers, even blue collar workers in some companies have got ESOPs. And as the companies have grown and done well, even the people, the employees who have contributed to that, even middle management and lower management have prospered.
Yeah, so the employees, yes, but if one looks at a wider scale of people who are not connected to them but are citizens of the country, uh, does it reach out to them? Then I guess there is a role for the government in terms of redistribution.
Mhm, mhm. The next question is from a Twitter user who's not given his name. The question is, what kind of mechanisms can ensure long-term regulatory uniformity, even if governments change to avoid disasters like retrospective taxation? Uh, is international arbitration in places like Singapore or Switzerland the only way forward?
No, I think I would want to refer this reader first to the volume one of the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission report, which lays down the principles of how you can make regulators more accountable, of how you make the process, regulation making process better, so that you don't just change something overnight, but you go through a process of consultation, of giving answers, of with stakeholders, with the public, and then taking feedback into account. You then make regulations. Also, I think the point made there is that it should regulation should not just be rules about rules, but also about principles, because many times the economy is changing very rapidly, society is changing very rapidly, and things, rules that, so I'll just give a very simple example. When you say a cap of 5,000 rupees for something, and if the cap remains unchanged for 20 years, 50 years, then actually it becomes meaningless. Or a fine that is imposed, if it doesn't remain proportionate to the penalty that should be imposed, is not proportionate when we fix these numbers and specific rules, because all of us are changing. So no, I don't think that Singapore arbitration is the way out. I think we need to improve our regulatory framework, our regulatory capacity, our regulatory laws, and our regulators. And please go and read the FSLRC report. It's on the Ministry of Finance website. It was submitted many years ago.
Uh, Aditya Vishwakarma has a question about the politics of economics. Why is the opposition so opposed to the private sector, even though the private sector functioned and prospered even when they were in power?
You see, India is largely a private economy. I mean, how much of of production in India is in the public sector? Very, very, very small. In fact, whatever is tried to be in the public sector, also it's not very efficient. What is there? All of agriculture is private. Bulk of manufacturing is private. Now, even infrastructure is private. Bulk of services is private. So we actually have a private sector. Now, when you talk about the opposition and what policies they criticize or what positions they take, I think a lot of that depends on who they are representing. Unions, for example, I mean, when the announcement for bank privatization has come, and the unions headed by opposition parties will protest against them, because unions don't want privatization. Privatization means that jobs will stop being permanent jobs where you don't need to go to, you can have that job for life. It doesn't depend on the work you do. So these are the kind of, there are various pulls and pressures. So that could very well be the reason why the opposition protests against these.
Hitesh Nautiyal is a regular viewer. Thanks, Hitesh, for being back on Ilanomics and for your question. Uh, Hitesh wants to know, ma'am, do you think that the government will be able to achieve its goal of privatization of banks and LIC, keeping in mind what you just said, the opposition from employees and unions?
Let's hope for the best.
That
I mean,
was
I think we've discussed it. You're a regular viewer, and this is something regularly comes up. If they had not announced anything, then I would have said nothing will happen because it wasn't announced. But if something is announced, I would rather, I want to believe that it will happen. After all, we need this to happen. So why should one start thinking that no, nothing will happen? After all, it has been announced. So let's be optimistic about that. Maybe they won't be able to do as much as they want to, but I mean, actually quite pleased that by coming out openly and talking about it rather than trying to do it by stealth, uh, mm, is I think that's good. And if you look at the farmer protests, so far the government has not backed off. So let's see, maybe even on privatization of banks, maybe if there are unions that are against it, the government may still go ahead and do it and not back off. So let's see.
there is a related question from Ayush Sapre. Hi, Ayush. The question is it a good idea to disinvest or privatize public sector companies that are doing quite well?
You see, I don't think it's a question of whether a company is doing well or not. Even if a company is doing well, my sense is that the government is devoting its resources, its time and effort, its focus on a particular company which actually is not producing public goods. It's not something that the government needs to be doing. So there are companies that do well, but they don't have to be run by babus. They can be run by the private sector. So it's not just about a company doing well. It's a broader and more strategic question of, do you want the government to be in this business, or do you want the government to be focusing its limited attention on public goods, things which only the government can do, on doing all the things that we've talked about in this article, on trying to improve contract enforcement, on trying to do reforms in the financial sector, on trying to build infrastructure, which the private sector wouldn't be able to do. So we want government to focus on public goods, not on running hotels, even if that hotel is profitable.
Mahit Tiwari asks a question that keeps getting asked quite frequently. Has India missed the manufacturing bus and now can only rely on the service sector in the private economy?
I think that in terms of large scale manufacturing, I'm not even sure that that is something that we should have been, that was even a bus that we should have been trying to catch.
Yes.
Because our strength uh, lies far more in the crafts, the skills, the diversity, the entrepreneurship that we see in the country. So perhaps large scale manufacturing did not work for India, not because we, failed at it, but because that was not something that was entirely suitable for India. Looking forward, so that's in the past. Now, looking forward, I don't even think that we should be trying to now do what China did 20 years ago, which is go for large scale manufacturing. I think that, there are so many things that we can do. We can focus on the upper end of the export market, for example. China was focusing on the lower end. The upper end of the export market, which wants organic, which wants handmade, which wants things that Indians are good at making, which wants, for example, so we were good at software because it needed the kind of entrepreneurship and initiative that we could provide. So I'm not even in favor of India trying to do what China did 20 years ago.
Mhm. Fazlul Karim is a very short question, and it sounds like a rhetorical question, which counters our column and the headline. Eli says, who is preventing the private sector to boost their growth?
I think you need to have many things for the private sector to be able to work. So, for example, contract enforcement. Now, if I want to buy something from you, I pay you, and you don't provide goods. The the reason why the state exists, the reason why we have a government, is so that this doesn't become an endless battle between these two people and their resources don't get stuck in it. So there should be a state apparatus to which uh, these parties can appeal, which would quickly resolve this dispute so that things can function. Similarly, banking, finance is something where there's a lot of asymmetric information. When there is asymmetric information, so I don't know who the bank is lending my savings to. I mean, I go and put money in in a savings deposit, and the bank lends it to somebody. Now, it could be Nirav Modi, it could be anybody, it could be a good project, it could be a bad project. I know nothing about it. So you need a regulator who actually monitors what the bank is doing, makes sure that it does not take excessive risk. Okay? And that is what allows the system to keep functioning. Otherwise, you have a system today. You have a system where uh, you are not good projects are not able to get credit. Uh, I mean, this is a long. I can keep on going on about it, but effectively, I think what you need to study, if many of our viewers are students, so that's why I'm using the word, you need to study what are public goods, what is the role of the state, why does the state do regulation, and how that is required for private enterprise to function.
We have a lot more questions, Ila, but I think we have time for one last question from Preeti Sekharan. Uh, she's asking us, what is the risk of the crowding out effect with the government getting into privatization at this time when the economy is just recovering from a recession?
I think the government is trying for a crowding in and not crowding out. by investing in infrastructures, what you typically get is more private investment in those sectors which use that infrastructure. So for example, if a road is built, and you've seen that in this budget there's an increased investment in capital expenditure on infrastructure, or expenditure on infrastructure. So let's say a road is built, then many businesses can come up that use that road, whether they transport food grain, whether they open shops around it, whether they use it to travel to school or cities or whatever it might be. But there is typically, when governments make investment in infrastructure, then there is typically a crowding in effect, not a crowding out effect. And I think that's what is being tried.
Thank you, Ila, and I would like to apologize to the following viewers whose questions we cannot take. Abhishek Trivedi, Prajwal, Krishna, uh, then there was Mahip Tiwari, uh, Vaibhav Alawat, Prem, Swetaketu Pandey, so many of them, and many of the questions were also not related to what we were discussing. So my apologies to all of you. We could not take your questions. We've been doing this for more than 30 minutes now, and we have to wind up. But please do come back with questions related to what we are talking about next week, and we will definitely answer them. And we will be back next Friday with a fresh episode of Ilanomics on the latest economic issue of the day. Thanks for watching, and please do watch our other shows and subscribe to the YouTube channel of The Print.